Everyone, and welcome to Strategies for Activist Development with Harry Han. My name is Sarah Woolley. I'm General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union and the current President of the General Federation of Trade Unions. This is now the 7th session in the JFTU Educational Trust's strategy series, and we hope that you'll sign up to the other fantastic sessions in the series that are all free to everyone. Tonight follows on from our last session, Union Strategy and the Crisis in Organised Labour with Bill Fletcher Jr., which is available with all the other sessions in this series on our YouTube channel, so you can catch up if you've missed some of them. If you can, we ask that you consider donating to the Trust and become a friend to help us continue delivering radical independent education for the whole trade union movement. Strategy is not just a word. Strategy is about how we all within the trade union and wider labour movement build the power and capacity to improve workers' lives. The employers have a strategy, the managers have a strategy, and it's absolutely vital that as a united labour movement that we build our own. This series will include discussions from leading thinkers on reviving the trade union movement, how we build union strategy, the role of women and feminist approaches to our unions, strategies for developing activists and the capacity to win big campaigns and small ones too. This is a webinar, which means you can see us, but you cannot see each other. Feel free to use the chat throughout the call, but to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will then ask your questions to Harry directly. Harry's going to speak for a maximum of 30 minutes before opening up to your questions. And we want to remind you all at this time that during the call, we will be following the JFTU Educational Trust Behaviour Statement, and the link has been put in the chat and it'll be put in again. If you do have any concerns, please read and follow that policy. So I am delighted to introduce Harry Han, who is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, the Stavros Niarchos, I may have pronounced that incorrectly, apologies, Foundation Professor of Political Science and Faculty Director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. She's an award-winning author of 4 books and numerous articles published in leading scholarly outlets, including the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, Nature Human Behavior, PNAS, the Journal of American Medical Association, and lots of others elsewhere. She's also written for outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. And she's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was named the 2022 Social Innovation Thought Leader of the Year by the World Economic Forum's Schwab Foundation. Her 5th book about faith and race in America with a focus on evangelical megachurches was published with Knopf in September 2024. So Harry, it is an absolute pleasure and a delight to be able to share the meeting with you tonight, and you're very welcome to come in and talk to us before we ask you some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you to everyone for being here and for inviting me to have this conversation with you. As Sarah said, I was going to start just by sharing some slides and some ideas about activist development, and then I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I hope that is working out. And someone, okay, great. So as Sarah said, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. I wear a couple different hats. I run a research lab called the P3 Lab. We call it the P3 Lab because we're dedicated to trying to understand how you make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful. So people have to be able to participate, they have to want to participate, and then it has to actually matter. So a lot of the work that we do is working with organizations like unions all over the world and putting data and learning around their work to try to understand what the strategies are that they can use to pull people off the sidelines into public life, and then how you scaffold people's engagement to translate their actions into the kind of political power and influence that they might want. And I always like to start just by saying a little bit more about how I got into this work. I know Sarah did a lovely job like reading my very boring bio, but like it's probably, to give you a sense of how I got into it. I grew up, as you can probably tell, in the United States. I'm the daughter of Korean immigrants and the granddaughter of refugees from North Korea to South Korea. And I sort of tell that story because I think one of the things that was really kind of clear to me growing up as a child of immigrants is this idea that transformation is not only possible, but it's a way of life, right? Like, I don't know that anyone ever said those words to me at the dinner table or anything like that. But growing up as a child of immigrants, like what I saw my parents doing was trying to remake their own lives, right? To remake their families and the opportunities for my brother and I, so as to be able to remake the world around us. And so we kind of grew up with this idea that transformation is a central part of the human experience. The picture in the middle of the screen is my family. I'm the little kid wearing the sweater in the middle, because like a lot of what my parents did, in the summers is like take us to Mount Rushmore because they thought that's what like American families did. They sort of were trying to figure out like what it meant to raise a family in the United States. The picture on the left is a picture of my dad's family when they were refugees from North Korea to South Korea, which again, I think was also a formative experience for me because even though I never experienced that, the stories that I heard from my grandfather really were important to us, mainly because the country, North Korea and South Korea, were split at a moment when no one quite expected it to happen. And so my grandfather had migrated south, intending to go back and then to establish himself in the south and then go back and get his mom and bring her south also. But because the border was split unexpectedly, he lost contact with his mom and his one of his sisters and never saw them again. And so what my grandfather grew up with was this sense of what it felt like to be a pawn in a game that someone else controlled. So this was like some geopolitical game that was being controlled by countries that were really distant from my grandfather and his experience, and yet it affected the very fabric of our family because he was sort of because he was sort of subject to this game. And so when I was growing up in the United States, like politics was absolutely not something we talked about at the dinner table. My dad is still not a citizen. My mom was naturalized when I was a child. But, kind of politics, political engagement, like that kind of stuff wasn't something that was really vibrant in our household. But when I went to college, I got involved in student activism, and by sheer accident, ended up in a class on community organizing. And I think when I learned organizing, it sort of it's kind of resonated with me and sparked a bunch of things because organizing, I think, spoke to a lot of the themes that I had experienced as a kid without necessarily knowing it. So first of all, I think one of the things that really differentiates organizing from other forms of social change is that organizers aren't trying to like sell you a product that you already want, right? Or convince you that you want a product that you may not want, right? Instead, what they're trying to do is they're making social change through transformation, which is what I'll talk about today. But also
Harry,
that,
can I just apologies? I didn't want to interrupt you. One of the attendees has just asked if you could just slow down slightly so the captions can keep up with you.
oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry. I was
No, no,
waiting for a break. I didn't want to interrupt you.
yeah,
Apologies.
it's okay. No, I talk fast. I talk fast. I get this all the time. Um, the other point that I was going to make, and I think the other reason why organizing resonated with me was because at the center of organizing is not only the idea of transformation, but the idea of equipping people to put their hands on the levers of change, right? So organizing is about trying to prevent the kind of experiences that my grandfather had, of feeling like they are pawns in a game that someone else controls. And so even though I had not grown up in a family of which this kind of discussion was very common, when I learned about it, it sort of opened up a world to me that I hadn't even known existed. And so I went on and worked in politics and campaigns and so on in the United States for a few years, and then eventually went to graduate school. And when I went to graduate school, I knew that what I wanted to do is try to study and understand how can we use research as a way of strengthening the practice of organizing, which is a lot of what I do. So what do I mean when I say organizing? There's kind of like three parts of the conversation I wanted to have with you today. First is like, why would you organize? Second, what is organizing? And third, does it actually work? So first, like, why organize? So let me just start by saying, if you can solve a problem without organizing, like, don't organize because it's really hard. So anyone who's tried to win a campaign through organizing knows that it's like banging your head against the wall, right? And so not every problem needs an organizing as a solution, right? Different problems require different solutions. So there are some problems that can be solved with information or technology, right? These are problems where when you give people the information or the technology that they need, then the people who need to make the change will act to make the change that is necessary, right? So an example that I give a lot is doctors used to tell parents, at least in the United States, to put their babies to sleep on their stomachs because they thought babies slept better that way. And then they discovered that actually it's better for childhood survival and decreasing rates of infant death if you have babies sleep on their back. So they told parents, have your baby go to sleep on its back, And that's a situation in which the parent, who is the person that needed to make the change, once they were given the information, had both the motivation and the authority to make the change that is necessary, right? The problem is there are a lot of problems in our society, and I would argue the stickiest problems in our society are problems where even when you give people the information or the technology that they need to make change, they are either not motivated or they don't have the authority to make the change that is necessary, right? And so that's a situation where the motivation and the authority to make change are not aligned. And that's what I would call a problem of power, right? And it's different from a problem of information or a problem of technology, because even if I gave you the technology to solve the problem, you wouldn't necessarily act to make that change because the people who need or want the change the most lack either the motivation and or the authority to make the change that they want, right? So a classic example is climate policy, where we actually have the technology for the world to be carbon neutral. But the problem is those who are in positions of power, right, lack the motivation to make the change that is necessary. And those who are motivated to make that change don't have the authority to make the change that's necessary, right? And so that mismatch between motivation and authority is what we call a problem of power. And so so if you can solve a problem by giving people information, that's a lot easier to do than actually organizing them, right? If you can solve a problem by giving people a technology, a new app on their phone, like that's a lot easier than organizing them, right? When you have a problem of power, you need to bring motivation and authority into alignment. That's what organizing does, right? So organizing essentially is a process through which people who need or want the change the most reconfigure the resources they have to acquire the motivation or the authority they need to make the change they want, right? So the people who need or want the change, the constituency, right, they have to figure out how do they use their resources and reconfigure them in order to acquire the power they need to make the change they want. And that brings motivation and authority into alignment. And so that process of organizing then ultimately, it's not just about figuring out how do we market information to a bunch of people or how do we get a new app into the hands of a lot of people, right? It's really about how do we sort of change these problems of motivation and alignment and engage people, right, and their resources in a way that's going to fix these problems of power. And so if we think about that, then the first thing to understand is that, students I always talk to my students and they're always like, well, fixing problems of power is really hard. And I'm like, yes, but that is true. But it is also true that power is not a fixed thing. And so I think one mistake that people make a lot is that they think about power as like something that I have, right? So it sort of is like my hair is black. If I was in London, my hair would still be black. I'm in Baltimore, my hair is black. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up. I hope my hair is still black. So it's like that is an attribute of me, right? But power is not an attribute of me. Power is an attribute of the relationship between me and another person or me and an organization, right? So it might be that when I'm a professor standing in front of a classroom and I control the syllabus and I have the microphone and I have the slides, then I have power in that situation, right? But if I'm the same person, I walk out of that classroom and I go to the airport and I try to get on a flight and then my flight is canceled, right? And I call United Airlines and I say, hey, you canceled my flight, then I'm going to not have power in that situation, right? So I can be the same person and not have power in one situation and have power in another, right? And so what that means is that power is an attribute of the relationship. I have power over you when I have resources that act on your interests. You have power over me when you have resources that act on my interests, right? We choose to use our power together, which is what we might think of as solidarity, if we each decide to use our resources to act on each other's interests, right? And so That means that those of us who might in some contexts feel like we don't have power can have power in other contexts if we figure out how to use our resources to act on other people's interests, right? And so the first thing to understand about organizing is that if we're trying to fix problems of power, that those problems are dynamic. Like that power is dynamic, right? It's a dynamic relationship. And so that means that we can act on it through the choices that we make about how we organize. And so the next point to make then is like, okay, so if organizing is a form of reconfiguring a constituency's resources to acquire the power they need to make the change they want, how do you reconfigure those resources, right? How does organizing work? So the first thing to understand is that not all forms of collective action are the same. And so I think a mistake that a lot of people make is they mistake what I would call mobilizing for organizing. Okay. And so the intuition behind that is mobilizing is like trying to get people to do a thing. Organizing is trying to get people to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done. Right? Do you see the difference? So I would, if I'm just trying to get lots of people to do a thing and to do it once, the way I'm going to reach out to them and how I'm going to engage them is different than if I'm trying to get people to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done. Right. And so another way to think about it is if you imagine an activist ladder where at the bottom are people who have the lowest form of engagement, like maybe they do nothing but affiliate with the labor movement, right? And the very top are the people who commit to developing the leadership of others, right? And there's many rungs of activity in between. What mobilizing does is essentially it meets people where they are and it acts like a net that's trying to capture people who are already motivated for whatever reason and creating opportunities for them to get involved. So you come and you say, hey, you want to give us 2 hours a week? Great. We're going to give you 2 hours worth of work to do, right? You want to just get your name on an email list? Great. We'll put your name on an email list, right? And so it just kind of matches opportunities for involvement with people who have some desire to be involved, right? It's what we'd call transactional engagement. Organizing, on the other hand, it's trying to move people from wherever they are on that activist ladder up that ladder, right? Because it's trying to help people become the kind of people who do what needs to be done, right? You have to develop an internal compass to figure out how to navigate the complex problems of power inequality in your life, right? That is a hard thing to do. There's no formula for it, right? The reason why there's no formula for it is because power is dynamic in the ways that we talked about. And so what you need people who are organizers that have the capacity to figure out in any given situation, how do I navigate this situation in a way that helps accrue power for the people that I stand for, And so organizing in that way is transformational, right? Because it's always trying to move people from wherever they are on the activist ladder up the ladder, right? So if mobilizing is like a net, then organizing is more like an engine. And what we found through our research is that the most effective social movements over time combine mobilizing and organizing, right? So it's not just that you need one or the other. You need the organizing to help you build depth, and you need mobilizing to help you build breadth, right? And effective social movements do both. Now, the allure of technology in the 21st century is that most movements, the mistake that they make is they focus only on mobilizing without doing any organizing, right? What they do is they get lots of people to do a thing, which turns out is really easy if you have social media and you know how to use technological tools and stuff like that really well. But then if you don't have the depth of organizers, then what ends up happening is that those movements might be able to get lots of spikes of activity at particular moments, but then they don't have the actual power to be able to bring motivation and authority into alignment. So they don't actually solve the problem that they're trying to solve. And so the challenge for movements to figure out how do we not only mobilize, but how do we also organize? And a lot of the work that I feel like we do in my lab is we try to figure out how that works, right? Because I think one of the things that I object to is when people kind of treat organizing like a black box, as if like, in goes outrage and then like something magical happens and then out pops like a movement on the other end or like some kind of victory, right? And actually, it turns out if you look at movements across history, movements across time, movements across countries, there's actual patterns that help us understand what the different strategies are for mobilizing and organizing. And so it turns out that it's not just like a semantic difference, right? I'm not just like using one word for one set of strategies and a different word for a different set of strategies, although I'm also doing that. Um, but the underlying mobilizing and organizing are different strategic choices that you make about how you build power, what you ask people to do, how you structure yourself, and so on and so forth. So the strategy for power and mobilizing is more numbers, right? It's breadth, getting as many people as possible to do a thing. The strategy for power and organizing is transformative leaders, right? Leaders who have that internal compass, who can be the kind of people who do what needs to be done and navigate tricky power dynamics in the work that they do. And so if you think about that different strategy for power, then it has implications for all these other choices that I might make. So if I'm just trying to get lots of people to do as many things as possible, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to try to ask them to do things that they can do alone, right? Because what is more time consuming than figuring out how to work with somebody else, right? Like, I'm a college professor, and if I tell my students that we have a group project coming up, it's like everyone groans, right? Like everyone hates group work, right? Why do you hate group work? Because it's such a pain to have to work with other people, right? So if I want to get as many people as possible to sign a petition, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create ways for them to do that that they can do on their computer or on their phone as quickly as possible without having to coordinate with anybody else. Organizing, on the other hand, because what they're trying to do is not just get people to do a thing, but actually push people up that activist ladder, they're going to create what organizers tend to do is create asks that force people to work with others, right? That are interdependent. And so what the research shows is that when you ask people to do things that are alone, you tend to get more people at the beginning. But then when you ask people to do things where they work with others, you might get fewer people at the beginning. But then after 6 months, more of those people are going to be involved over the long term, right? Because putting people into situations where they develop relationships with other people, then those relationships are what becomes a durable source of commitment down the road. So the kinds of things that we ask people to do are really different. Another thing is structure. How do we structure ourselves? If I'm a mobilizer where I'm just trying to get as many people as possible to do a thing, then usually what it tends to happen is that we centralize control over the campaign or over the movement or over the organization into the hands of a few paid professional staff, right? So control is centralized, right? Because we're just trying to get them to generate opportunities that they can use to match with people who are already motivated to do things out there. But if I'm trying to develop, right, the kind of depth that organizing depends on, then what we see is that the structure tends to be very decentralized. And it's not that it's decentralized in the way that, all the ships are sailing in like 95 different directions, right? You still need everyone to be shared, working towards a common strategy. But the idea is that, like a shorthand for it, to think about it is like you want to have national purpose, but local action, right? And so there should be a shared strategy that is centrally developed and centrally agreed upon and everything like that. But each individual local unit needs to have some decentralized authority over how they accomplish that in their community. So an easy example would be like an electoral campaign. It might be, for example, that we'd say, in order for this candidate to win, we need 20,000 votes in this community. So that number, 20,000, is going to come from some, set of calculations that's done at the national level, right? But then we're going to go to the leaders in the local community and say, hey, you know your community better than anybody else. Figure out how to get 20,000 votes, right? We're not going to tell you if you need a phone bank, if you need to go to the union hall, if you need to go hang out in the local coffee shop, if you should talk to the pastors. Like, you figure out how you're going to get those 20,000 votes. But that's what you need to do, is get the 20,000 votes, right? And the idea is that people in their own local community, whether it's geographic or constituency based or issue based or whatever it is, they can use their knowledge and their networks to be able to develop strategy independently, right? And that strategic development is an important part of people developing their own capacities. Anyways, and so there's other kind of things like that we can kind of talk about, but the basic idea is that the differences between mobilizing and organizing are not semantic. They translate into a set of choices that we make about what we ask people to do, how we structure ourselves for work, what are the ways in which we're constructing identities for people to work with each other, like that kind of a thing. And maybe the last thing that I'll say before I sort of wrap up is, in the most recent kind of big project that I did was this project on evangelical megachurches in the United States. It resulted in a book called Undivided. That's the cover of the book that came out last fall. And in that project, I learned a ton about how you think about these kinds of organizing strategies, but how they operate at scale. And so to give you a sense, a mega church is a church that has at least 2,000 attendees. In the United States, church attendance has become so skewed toward large churches that the top 9% of churches by size contain 50% of the church-going population in the US. And these churches are growing. So while a lot of small churches in the US are diminishing or dying off, 3/4 of mega churches in the last period that we have the data from reported growing by about 34%. And even more than that, the average mega church in the United States has about 6,000 participants, a budget of $5 million. 96% of that budget comes from individual donations. So other than labor, that is the only organization voluntary or association that I know of in the United States that is funded almost entirely through individual donations, right? In the United States, the social sector is funded almost entirely by philanthropic donors or like large high net worth individuals, right? And other than sort of labor unions that have sort of laws that protect kind of like paycheck, hey, and you don't see this very often. And so what that means is that people here in these churches are not only attending, but they're actively engaged, right? They're giving their resources. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask through this research is trying to understand, what did churches do to be able to generate so much activity at such scale with such high levels of commitment, right? In a society where we know that that's a really hard thing to do. And so the church that I studied the most closely was a church called the Crossroads Church. It's the third largest church in America. They have an annual budget of over $65 million. They get 35,000 people to show up each week in person, right? So 35,000 people a week is a huge effort in the United States, right? Like we don't have any political organization that can do that. And they get about 500,000 people to show up online, right? So they have this enormous scale. And there's like so much that I learned from this process, and the book kind of like chronicles a lot of that story. The book is about people who are organizing around racial justice within the context of these churches. And so it focuses particularly on race. So I won't get into that, but I'll just sort of say one thing and then I'll close, which is that one of the things that that really became clear to me in looking at how these churches engage people in community was that they were constantly engaging people in ways that try to cultivate people's sense of their own agency, right? That gave people a sense that they could be the ones who are architects of their own future. They were not pawns in someone else's game, like my grandfather felt, So what does that mean to create agency enhancing opportunities, right? So I'm a social scientist, so of course I had to like break it down into a 2x2 table. And so if you imagine a 2x2 table where on one dimension is like a social dimension, right? What is a social environment that we're creating for people? Are we inviting them into activities that are isolated and individualistic, or are we inviting them into activities in which they feel high social connection and a community of belonging, right? And then another dimension is not just the social dimension, but like a learning dimension, right? Are people being invited into activity where they learn something, right? Where they're invited to take risks, to make mistakes, to fail, right? What I would argue is that the vast majority of our political world invites people into activities that are in the bottom left corner. This is mobilizing, right? Where you're invited to be a cog in a giant machine that someone else is controlling, right? So you're invited to do things that are isolated and alone, and that you're not developing and doing any strategic learning, right? So it's like sign a petition, but then let our professional staff decide what that petition is going to say, what we're going to do with the petition, when we're going to send it, who we're going to send it to. Like all that stuff is like, I'm outsourcing my outrage to these professionals over here, right? What the church did so effectively is all the things they were inviting people into was in this top right corner, where they were inviting people into things where people felt high connection, high social connection, high community of belonging. And that social community, that community of belonging, it gave people the social comfort to take strategic risks, so that you could invite people to say, hey, figure out how to get 20,000 votes. And people would put out some ideas, and some of them would be terrible, like that was okay, or in the context of what I was studying, they were inviting people to think about what did it mean to act on your commitment to racial justice. you know, and it was people who are white, who are black, who are engaged in this conversation with each other, and they would inevitably make mistakes in how they answered that question, right? But people were invited to take risks, but because they were in these communities of belonging across difference, they were able to take risks that sort of help them develop themselves as constituents, as actual agents in the political process, as opposed to cogs in someone else's machine. And so I'm not going to go into this data because it's a little bit long, but I'll just sort of say that I think, you know, you might have heard that politics in the United States these days is a little turbulent, you know, and I would argue that one of the problems that we face not only in the US, but all around the world is that increasingly you have a gap between people who feel like they are subjects and objects in the political system. You know, and so there's a small group of people, and political scientists like me estimate it's 10 to 15% of people who feel like they are still subjects, right? Who can make choices, who can act agentically in the political world. But you know, 85 to 90% of people feel like they're objects, they're cogs in a machine. You know, that machine is someone else's machine. And you know what happens? There's a famous African proverb that says, "The child who does not feel the warmth of his village, who does not feel his village's love, will burn it down to feel its warmth." Right. And so people who feel like they're pawns in someone else's game, you know, you couple that with income inequality and all the other trends that you know, then people are like, why would I play this game? You know, I'm just a pawn in someone else's game. And so I think this question of how we cultivate people's agency is central, not only to the work of organizing and building the movements and solving the problems of power that we talked about, but also just kind of thinking about what this particular political moment is that we're in. So I will pause and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that. I always love these sessions because I sit here and get as much out of it as everybody else does listening online.